Welcome back to Into the Paradox, the show where we dive headfirst into the most perplexing questions of our time, seeking understanding where others might only find confusion. I'm your host, Peter, and today we're tackling a topic that has infiltrated every corner of modern discourse, fueled by information and misinformation alike, the realm of conspiracy. Our question today is stark. Can conspiracy go too far, or should it in fact go a lot further? To help us navigate this treacherous terrain, we have two deeply influential, albeit vastly different voices. First, a man who has dedicated decades to unraveling what he believes are the hidden truths behind global events, challenging the very fabric of accepted reality, the one and only David Icke. David, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Good to be here.
And our second guest is a renowned professor of psychology, a clinical psychologist, and a cultural critic whose work often explores the structures of meaning, belief, and the individual's journey through chaos, the esteemed Dr. Jordan Peterson. Jordan, great to have you on the show.
Peter, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Gentlemen, this is going to be a fascinating discussion. David, let's start with you. The premise of our show is Into the Paradox. For you, what is the core paradox when it comes to the public perception and acceptance of what you term the truth versus what is dismissed as conspiracy theory?
The paradox, Peter, is that people are constantly told to trust authority, governments, media, science, all of whom have a track record of lying, manipulating, and deceiving. Yet when someone connects the dots, points to hidden agendas, and offers a different explanation for global events, they are immediately ridiculed, labeled conspiracy theorists, and dismissed. The paradox is that people are more comfortable believing the obvious lie than facing a truth that would shatter their perceived reality. They'd rather live in the comfortable cage of mainstream narrative than wake up to the vast interlocking system of control that genuinely operates the world.
A powerful opening. Jordan, you've spoken extensively about the human need for narrative, the dangers of ideological possession, and the complexity of human motivation. When you hear David's perspective, what resonates with you, and where do you find yourself diverging, particularly on this idea of hidden truth versus accepted lie?
Well, David correctly points to the human susceptibility to deception, and the historical record is replete with examples of authorities, whether political, religious, or economic, engaging in self-serving narratives, manipulation, and outright falsehoods. So the idea that one should be skeptical of power structures is not only reasonable, but ethically necessary. That much I believe we can agree upon. Where I begin to diverge, perhaps, is on the nature of the hidden truth and the mechanism by which these grand conspiracies are alleged to operate. The universe is unbelievably complex, and human beings are unbelievably complex. To posit a single, monolithic, perfectly coordinated cabal requires a suspension of disbelief that often attributes a level of competence and unified intention to people that they simply do not possess. Most large organizations struggle to coordinate their right hand with their left, let alone engaging in centuries-long, perfectly executed global machinations. My concern, Peter, is often less about the veracity of any specific conspiracy, some of course have proven true, but more about the psychological impact of framing the world in terms of a perfectly malevolent, omniscient external force. It can lead to a kind of Gnostic despair, paralyzing agency, and diverting attention from the individual's responsibility and the inherent chaos and malevolence within the human heart itself, which is often a far more potent source of suffering than any external cabal.
Fascinating. David, Jordan raises an important point about the practicalities of a perfectly coordinated cabal and the potential for psychological paralysis. How do you respond to the idea that the sheer scale and longevity of the conspiracies you describe might make them implausible, and that such a worldview could disempower individuals rather than empower them?
With respect, Jordan, that's precisely what they want you to believe. They want you to think it's too complex, too grand, too implausible, so you don't even try to look. The coordination isn't perfect in every detail, but the agenda is consistent. And it's not about individuals coordinating every single step. It's about a hierarchical structure, like a corporation or a military, where the agenda is set at the top, and those below, often unknowingly, implement it. It's a network, secret societies, banking families, global organizations, all working towards a common goal of centralized control. And far from disempowering, understanding this empowers people. When you know you're being manipulated, you can choose not to comply. When you see the prison bars, you can start looking for the door. The paralysis comes from not knowing, from internalizing the mainstream narrative and feeling helpless within it. My work is about showing people the nature of the cage so they can finally find their own freedom. It's about waking up to the fact that much of what we call reality is a sophisticated illusion designed to keep us enslaved.
Jordan, the idea of a sophisticated illusion, or a matrix as David often refers to it, is a powerful mythological construct. From a psychological perspective, why do such narratives hold so much appeal? And what is the distinction for you between a useful archetypal narrative and one that might lead to maladaptive thinking?
The appeal is undeniable, Peter. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We abhor a vacuum of meaning. When traditional narratives, religious, patriotic, communal, begin to fragment as they have in the modern West, people become profoundly susceptible to new meta-narratives that purport to explain everything. A grand conspiracy theory offers a comprehensive explanation for the chaos, the perceived injustices, the suffering, and the uncertainty of existence. It provides a clear enemy, which simplifies a world that is inherently ambiguous. It gives a sense of knowledge and special insight to the believer, elevating them above the unwoke masses. This can be a very potent psychological balm to anxiety and existential dread. The distinction between a useful narrative and a maladaptive one lies in its relationship to reality, its capacity for modification in the face of counter-evidence, and its promotion of individual responsibility. A useful narrative, like a religious myth, might guide behavior and promote individual development, but it also acknowledges the inherent mystery and recalcitrance of the world. A maladaptive narrative, particularly a conspiratorial one taken to its extreme, tends to become totalizing, explaining everything through its lens, resistant to falsification, and often externalizing all blame onto the other, the cabal, the elites, the system. This externalization, while psychologically comforting in the short term, ultimately disempowers the individual, because if all problems originate externally, then what agency do you have in their resolution?
David, you often present what you believe to be extensive evidence, connecting disparate events, historical figures, and symbols. However, skeptics often argue that your interpretations, while intricate, rely on circumstantial links and a tendency to connect dots that aren't necessarily related, rather than provable causal chains. How do you address the critique that your approach prioritizes pattern recognition over rigorous scientific methodology?
The rigorous scientific methodology they demand, Peter, is often the very methodology controlled by the institutions I'm critiquing. We're talking about a system that actively suppresses dissenting information, silences whistleblowers, and controls the mainstream narrative through media ownership and academic funding. What they call scientific is often just another brick in the wall of their control. My evidence isn't just circumstantial links. It's thousands upon thousands of hours of research, connecting historical documents, statements from whistleblowers, patterns of behavior, symbolism, and outcomes that simply cannot be explained by random chance or transparent political processes. When you see the same families, the same secret societies, the same geopolitical strategies playing out across centuries, influencing wars, economies, and public health, you'd have to be willfully blind to dismiss it as coincidence. The dots are there for anyone to see. They're just scattered across a vast landscape, and I've spent my life creating the map. The burden of proof is also on those who say chaos rules when the outcomes are so predictable and beneficial to a select few.
Jordan, David is essentially arguing for a different epistemology, a different way of knowing and validating information. He posits that the very systems we're told to trust for rigorous methodology are compromised. From your perspective, what are the dangers and potential merits of adopting such an alternative epistemology, one that prioritizes pattern recognition and challenges established sources of truth?
There's merit in challenging established sources, Peter. That's how progress is made, how science advances. Healthy skepticism is vital. The Enlightenment, in many ways, was a radical skepticism of dogma and unquestioned authority.
The danger, however, lies in what replaces the established sources and the criteria for the new truth. If the criteria becomes simply it challenges the mainstream, and any pattern, however tenuous, is elevated to proof of a grand design, then you've essentially moved from one form of dogma to another, albeit one that is inverted. You create a system where anything that contradicts the new narrative is dismissed as part of the illusion, and anything that supports it, however weakly, is hailed as undeniable proof. This is a closed system of thought, impenetrable by rational discourse or empirical challenge. My concern is that while pattern recognition recognition as a fundamental aspect of human intelligence, it's also highly susceptible to apophenia, seeing meaningful connections where none exist. We evolved to see predators in the bushes, true, but too much of that can lead to paranoia. And a worldview built on paranoia, where everyone and everything is part of a malevolent plot, is a deeply unhealthy and ultimately unsustainable way to live. It fractures trust, amplifies fear, and can lead to a kind of psychological isolation that is devastating for individuals and corrosive for societies.
David, Jordan speaks of the psychological isolation and fear that can result from a worldview built on paranoia. Many would argue that the proliferation of conspiracy theories, particularly in the age of social media, is creating deep societal divides and undermining the very possibility of collective action on shared problems. Do you see any responsibility for the potential societal fragmentation that might arise from people adopting a worldview consistent with your theories?
I see the responsibility for societal fragmentation lying squarely with the deceivers, Peter, not with those who expose the deception. The fragmentation already exists because governments and corporations are constantly lying to the public, creating false flags, manufacturing consent, and eroding trust. People are already divided because they're being pitted against each other by design. My aim is not to divide, but to unite people against the common enemy, the manipulators. If people are waking up to how they've been misled, and that causes a temporary disruption, it's a necessary step towards a more honest and free society. The fear and isolation Jordan speaks of are not inherent to the truth. They are the result of the initial shock of realizing the extent of the deception, which is quickly followed by empowerment if you choose to act on that knowledge. The real danger is not exposing the conspiracy, allowing the manipulators to continue their agenda unopposed. That's how true enslavement happens.
Jordan, David has framed the issue as one of uniting against a common enemy. You've often warned about the dangers of identifying a singular, external enemy and the pathologies that can arise from such an ideology, especially in the context of political and social movements. Can you elaborate on that and how it might apply here?
Yes, Peter. The identification of a singular external enemy, whether it's the capitalist class, the oppressors, or in this case, the cabal, while providing a powerful unifying force, also carries immense dangers. Firstly, it simplifies a multivariate world into a binary of good versus evil, us versus them, which always loses vital information. Secondly, it often absolves individuals of their own moral shortcomings and responsibilities, projecting all malevolence onto the external other. I am good, noble, and pure. The enemy is evil, cunning, and corrupt. This is a profoundly dangerous psychological posture. Thirdly, when you identify a singular omnipotent enemy, it rationalizes almost any means to combat that enemy. We've seen throughout history where such ideological frameworks, be they communist, fascist, or radical religious, have led to immense suffering, purges, and violence, all in the name of defeating the perceived ultimate evil. The pathway to tyranny is often paved with good intentions to defeat a single externalized adversary.
While skepticism of authority is good, the ideal outcome isn't to replace one monolithic truth with another, but to cultivate individuals who are profoundly capable of critical thought, who take responsibility for their own perceptions and actions, and who understand that the deepest problems often lie within the human individual and the complex interactions between them, not just in some hidden external force.
We're nearing the end of our discussion, gentlemen. I want to give each of you a final word, returning to our core question: can conspiracy go too far, or should it go a lot further? David Icke, your final thoughts.
It should go a lot further, Peter. Not the conspiracy itself, but our investigation into it. We are only scratching the surface of how deeply controlled and manipulated human society is. Until people truly grasp the scale of the operation, the non-human element, the ancient origins, the meticulously planned future for humanity, we will never be truly free. The greatest conspiracy isn't just about money or power. It's about the very nature of reality and consciousness itself being hijacked. So yes, we need to go much, much further in our questioning, our research, and our awakening. The future of humanity depends on it.
Thank you, David Icke. And Jordan Peterson, your concluding thoughts.
The question isn't whether conspiracies can go too far, but perhaps whether any explanation, including conspiratorial ones, can go too far when it becomes a totalizing ideology. The human psyche is capable of both immense good and profound malevolence, and our institutions reflect that. Vigilance is paramount. Skepticism of power is necessary, but the pursuit of truth must also be tempered with intellectual humility, a commitment to rigorous evidence, and a profound understanding of the complexity of the world and, crucially, the complexity of the human heart. When an explanation becomes so all-encompassing that it precludes individual responsibility or genuine progress, then it has gone too far. We must be wise enough to critically analyze, but also strong enough to bear the burden of that analysis and act constructively within the world we find ourselves in.
David Icke, Jordan Peterson, Thank you both for this incredibly stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. You've given our listeners a tremendous amount to consider.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. And that is all the time we have for this episode of Into the Paradox. What a journey we've been on today, exploring the very boundaries of belief, skepticism, and human understanding. A huge thank you to David Icke and Dr. Jordan Peterson for sharing their invaluable insights. Our employees, join us next. Join us next time on Into the Paradox as we continue our quest for understanding in a world full of questions. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, and always dare to look into the paradox.